so much for coming to us, to Belfast. And I have this series of questions, 4 questions, but it's up to you how we will continue with that. And can you give us a background to the conflict in Upper Silesia and the wider context of redrawing of border post First World War?
Certainly, that's a big question, of course, and I think my starting point would be that this process of redrawing borders across Europe and the Middle East that takes place from 1917 to about 1923 comes out of the First World War, this massive, titanic struggle that has cost tens of millions of lives. And it has the effect of essentially placing some age-old empires and multinational states under a degree of strain and stress that they cannot take, and one by one they begin to collapse. First Russia in 1917, then Austria-Hungary, then Germany in 1918, and also the Ottoman Empire across the Middle East. And what this does is really create a series of chaos and confusion right across Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, in which a new basis needs to be found to set up states and political units. The idea of national self-determination takes really first place. So this is very much pushed by the American President Woodrow Wilson. He believes that a more peaceful world can be created if peoples are ruled by their own kind. You know, if Poles are ruled by Poles and not by Austrians and Russians and Germans, and so on and so forth. So rather than an old-style world of dodgy dealings between various empires and diplomats, that democracy will depend upon national self-determination. It will depend upon nationalism. Now, this is an exciting idea. As I say, it's given a huge push by Woodrow Wilson. It's also given a huge push, effectively, by Lenin. One of the ways that the Bolshevists and the communists realize you can bring down Tsarist Russia is by promising people their freedom. The main problem, of course, is that not all people of one kind live in one place. They live in all kinds of intermingled and mixed up ways. And whose claims are going to triumph is really the big question that dominates the post-war world. And very many national leaders in very many countries ask themselves the question, why should I be a minority in your state when I can be a majority in my own state? So that is really the big picture of what is happening. And if you like, the sort of crazy paving of new borders and new frontiers, many of which are then redrawn very quickly, spreads right across the Middle East and across Europe. And in many ways, we are still living with those consequences. When ISIS demolished the border posts between Iraq and Syria in 2014, what they were doing was saying, we're getting rid of this post-First World War settlement. So a lot of, say, of the borders that were created are still problematic 100 years later. Ireland is a bit of a special case, and the reason it's a special case is very simple, that Great Britain was not a losing power. Most of the countries I've just described, or empires I've just described, they collapsed, they fell apart because they'd lost in the First World War. And Great Britain is not in that position. So the creation of the Irish border and the downsizing, the shrinking of the United Kingdom is in many ways part of the same general process, but it is a little bit less chaotic simply because, as I say, Britain remains a strong state. There's also a long backstory here that ever since 1886 there had been a demand in British politics that Ireland was not just another part of the United Kingdom, it should have some measure of what was called home rule or some sort of limited self-government. So that had already been on the British political agenda and caused multiple crises in 1886, in 1893, in 1914. So that had been rumbling around in the background, and what World War I does is really sort of crack that wide open, and out of a very messy process, the old style solutions of Home Rule give way to a greater degree of independence for Ireland. That's really what happens. An armed campaign by the IRA moves the debate in that direction. But, as I say, Britain remains strong, and it doesn't give the whole of the island of Ireland independence. It carries on hanging on to the 6 counties that we call Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland.
And the conflict in Upper Silesia?
The conflict in Upper Silesia, thank you for the prompt. The conflict in Upper Silesia is one of the conflicts that is part of this process of redrawing of empires. So if you go to Upper Silesia today, just outside Katowice, you can go and see the Three Emperors' Corner. The Three Emperors' Corner is where 2 small rivers meet, and you can literally stand there. One bit used to be Germany before 1914, one bit used to be Poland, and one bit used to be Austria-Hungary.
And now it's Poland.
And now it is all Poland. So essentially what happens in Upper Silesia, Poland at this stage has not existed on the map of Europe for 123 years. So it's a remarkable success story of the rebirth of a state in chaotic conditions after a world war. They have, there's, I think, at least 3 different railway gauges, 6 different currencies. It's very, very difficult circumstances to build any kind of fresh state, and there's all kinds of border disputes. And Upper Silesia is one of them. Upper Silesia is particularly important because of its industry and because of its coal. At that stage, coal, we think of coal now as a dirty fuel, as an environmental problem, but in 100 years ago it was like having oil. It was a major economic resource, and 24% of Germany's coal came from Upper Silesia. So Germany, of course, wanted to hang on to Upper Silesia, and the new Polish state, of course, wanted it from an industrial point of view. The really awkward question was, what did the Upper Silesians think of this? And that proved remarkably difficult to find out. Nationality in Upper Silesia was not straightforward. There were some elements of the local population were definitely pro-German. There were some elements that were definitely pro-Polish, but there wasn't a clear answer as to which way most Upper Silesians would jump if they were given the chance. The Ślązak, the Silesian dialect that many of them spoke, was certainly Polish in basic form, but also heavily inflected with German. But I think more importantly, it wasn't clear just from what languages people spoke at home how they saw themselves. It reminds us that nationality can be a very complicated phenomenon, and that really what matters is people's self-image. So, to cut a long story short, this became quite an issue at the Versailles Peace Treaty. I think it's important to stress that fairly cynical great power politics were at work, and that really the chief argument becomes between Britain and France. So America is already becoming quite distracted and less involved. And really it becomes a major argument in the spring of 1919, the summer of 1919, in which Germany doesn't really get a say, but Britain feels it doesn't want to weaken Germany too much, because Britain doesn't want France to become too powerful, even though they've just been allies. France wants to see Germany definitely weakened. And so really the decision that they come up with to hold a plebiscite, to hold a referendum in Upper Silesia in 1919, is really about resolving an argument between the British and the French, and not between the Germans and the Poles, and certainly not for the Upper Silesians. But the Upper Silesians get the choice. A plebiscite zone is created. And it's this extraordinary experiment, probably the largest such experiment in European and world history, that a couple of million people get a chance to vote which country they want to belong to. And what becomes clear is that many of them are actually very ambivalent, and that they can be kind of swayed by arguments back and forth. And a lot of the arguments are actually not about nationality, not about national belonging, not about a kind of romantic sense of identity and where you belong, but, you know, really quite bread and butter issues of, you know, will you get better childcare, will you get better welfare in this country or the other country? And both sides promise massive advantages. Eventually, there's a lot of trouble. There's a couple of uprisings that take place that quite a few people die. And then in March 1921, the plebiscite is held eventually. And it basically creates a sort of a result that nobody knows what to do with. It's 60% of those that vote to stay in Germany, 40% vote to stay in Poland, but it's not clear cut. As I said, the problem with self-determination is people live in all kinds of mixed up ways. And so really how you interpret that decision and what you do with it then becomes the next flashpoint issue. There's then an uprising on the Polish side that really turns into a kind of mini proxy civil war between the German and Polish sides, and probably a couple of thousand people die. Before Britain and France get a lid on the situation, and they then finally, in late 21, early 1922, they implement a partition, a splitting of Upper Silesia. That pleases no one and creates all kinds of problems, but is, I think, part of this wider drawing of new boundaries and partitions that is such a feature of post-1918 Europe. Of course, all this changes again after 1945 when it all becomes Poland. That's worth just making clear it's all Poland now.
To what extent was Ireland a template for modern terrorism and conflict resolution?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's an excellent two questions because they're very different in many ways. I think it is fair to say that in many ways Ireland has been, in the modern period, and I'm talking now of 150 years or so, quite a laboratory for what we tend to think of as terroristic violence, bombings and so on and so forth. A few examples. In 1883, the first bombings of the London Underground are carried out. And they're carried out by Irish Americans using dynamite bombs with clocks on the London Underground Railway. And this bombing campaign goes on for a couple of years. They bomb the Tower of London, they bomb that Westminster. It's quite modern stuff, and it's really the first terrorism bombing campaign in history anywhere in the world. Interestingly, as I say, run by Irish Americans out of America, but all in the cause of Irish freedom as they see it. There are then, the period after World War I, which I've alluded to, where I think Ireland does create, or there emerges, a sort of template that revolutionary movements in the 20th century do copy, and copy widely. Polish nationalists in Upper Silesia say that they're imitating the IRA. Indian nationalists in the 1920s say they're imitating the IRA. The Irgun, Jewish Zionist terrorists in the 1930s, copy the IRA. So it does become quite a template. And when I say a template, what is new about it is twofold. I mean, really, what happens after World War I is that the previous British attempts to create a settlement basically get put on ice, and the situation drifts. And out of that situation comes a radicalisation of Irish public opinion. There's been an uprising, the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. This is a really sort of key moment in modern Irish history where only about 1,000 people, 1,000 pretty extreme, by contemporary standards, pretty extreme Irish Republicans tries to stage a revolt against Britain in the middle of World War I, claiming alliance with Germany. They're never going to win militarily. It's a hopeless rising, but of course it's very dramatic. It captures the headlines. There hasn't really been anything in it in Ireland like it for decades and decades, and it gives the British a very nasty shock. Because of that shock, they end up executing some of the Irish rebel leaders. They don't shoot very many by worldwide standards, but they shoot enough. They shoot enough to really change Irish public opinion. And Irish public opinion really shifts from majority support for home rule. In other words, we don't expect total independence, but we would like some degree of freedom, of autonomy, but we'll stay within the United Kingdom. It shifts from that to demands for total separatism, for leaving the United Kingdom. And the problem, of course, for Britain is, what do you do about that? And they face a problem that many governments have faced since, which is they don't really want to admit how serious the trouble is. They don't want to admit that from 1919, really something like a war has broken out in Ireland. And so they try to deal with it by beefing up the police force. They do end up using the army, but they're reluctant to use the army. They want to use the police. And so they recruit a load of ex-soldiers into the police, the so-called black and tans and auxiliaries, and they go around really behaving terribly. You know, they burn down Cork city centre. If there's any ambushes, if the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the separatists attack, then you get this brutal counterinsurgency measures, burning villages, burning towns, so on and so forth. The problem is, for Britain, this is very embarrassing. And that is the dilemma, that by the summer of 1921, Britain faces a choice. It faces a choice between massively repressing Ireland, which it could have done. It had the force to do it. You know, just to be clear, 268 British soldiers are killed in Ireland between 1919 and 1921. In the World War between 1914 and 18, the British Empire loses 765,000 people or so. So it can afford the casualties, but it's too politically embarrassing, especially for the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, who's a Liberal. And they decide, OK, we'll cut a deal. The messy deal they end up cutting is one that basically gives 26 counties, now the Republic of Ireland, some degree of freedom that it later becomes a republic, and then the 6 counties that become Northern Ireland in the partition. It's a messy process. I'll keep it short, but that's the basic kind of deal. So summing all this up, has Ireland served as a kind of laboratory for terrorist experimentation? Yes. Has it served as a laboratory for how you combine a mass movement with political demonstrations, good use of the media, embarrassing your opponent with evidence of human rights abuses, with a sort of guerrilla campaign with an armed edge as well? Yes, that's exactly what the Irish Republican movement does in 1919 to 21. Alongside the IRA, there's a kind of parliament, an underground parliament, the Dáil Éireann, and they've very successfully managed to combine the two. Does it provide a sort of lessons in counterterrorism and the mistakes you can make? Yes, it does as well, I think, this period. What about peace settlements, though? I mean, I think I would say a couple of things. Looking back at the events of nearly 100 years ago or so, just because a conflict dies down and the violence dies down doesn't mean it's solved. Mm-hmm. So the partition that apparently does lead to a new Irish settlement, appears by the mid-1920s, late 1920s, 1930s. It looks, it's beginning to bed down, it's beginning to settle. Now, we know with hindsight that that settlement was a lot less stable than it looked. And particularly in Northern Ireland, the problem, as I keep going back to this point about self-determination and mixed populations, the problem, of course, was that only 2/3 of the population were Protestant and pro-British and unionist in broad terms. 1/3 were Catholic and nationalists, and they just felt in the wrong state. And they would always feel in the wrong state. And when conditions change in the 1960s, that could turn very violent again. So I think in terms of the sort of peace settlement of 1922, it's important to realise that just because the violence dies down doesn't mean that the causes of conflict are necessarily solved. And much of the last 100 years, the recent troubles, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 is essentially, in that tradition, I think 1998 is a big advance on 1922 because it did acknowledge that different communities had different aspirations, and that wasn't crazy that unionists and nationalists could want different things, and it wasn't crazy for them both to want different things. In 1922, Catholic nationalists are just ignored, and that's a problem that comes back to haunt Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Can you outline the backgrounds and events of two infamous atrocities, McMahon murders and the Ultnavey massacre, and how the two men accused of being responsible went on to hold high office in respective jurisdictions?
Thank you. That is a tall order. Those are two very specific questions about two really awful events that happened in the early 1920s. So a bit of background is needed. I've talked about the big picture of Irish partition, but it's important to note that events in the north of the island, in what was becoming Northern Ireland, followed a very different pattern from the rest of the island, basically because there was a divided community between unionists and nationalists. And out of that came a complicated conflict in which the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, was trying to rebel against British rule, as it was throughout the rest of the island, but it was meeting resistance from the unionist community, and particularly from hardline unionists, from loyalists. Shipyard workers were particularly hardline. And one of the ways that London and Britain tries to deal with this is, as always, by saving money. So they don't want to send the army, they don't want to use the army too much, they do use them a bit, but they end up trying to beef up the police force. I've mentioned the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. They were mostly used in the 26 counties. In the north, or the northeast corner, in the new Northern Ireland, basically what they did was create a special constabulary. Now the special constabulary was simply Protestant men allowed to be part-time policemen. And there were A specials who were full-time, there were B specials who were part-time. And there were a lot of them. And that's the important thing to note, that Northern Ireland survived because it just created lots and lots and lots of these part-time policemen, and in the end, too many for the IRA to cope with. However, if you just create an instant police force, don't expect its discipline and its training to be very professional. And one of the real arguments amongst historians about the 1920s is what we make of the B specials. Did they save Northern Ireland, or did they just save up lots and lots and lots of bitterness and cruelty for years to come? And you can argue that back and forth. The McMahon murders of March 1922 are a classic case. It's important to note that the first 6 months of 1922 are the worst period for political violence in Belfast's history ever. 1922 was the first half of 1922 was much worse even than the later Troubles from the 1970s onwards. About 298 people are killed in the city. It's about twice the killing rate of 1972, another awful year. So 1922, the first half of it, is really, really grim. There's a sort of constant drip, drip, drip of murders, of shooting of policemen, of loyalists shooting Catholics, of rioting, gun battles every night in the city, every morning in the city. It's a really, really difficult time, and the government is very, very worried that it cannot get a grip on the situation, and that this IRA insurgency and intercommunal sectarian violence is getting out of control. And so, unfortunately, some elements of the police, which was then called the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and some elements of the B Specials, this new auxiliary force that was helping the police, they begin to think about how they can try and send a message to the IRA and the Catholic minority to stop their violence. And the temptation is, of course, to forget the law and just go and show the minority who is more powerful. So what happens in late March is 2 policemen are shot in the city centre. This has happened before. And that night, off the Antrim Road at a place called Kinnaird Terrace, there is a front door is smashed in with a sledgehammer. The choice of target is very unusual. Owen McMahon is a middle-class Catholic who owns a string of pubs in the city. He's also a director of Glentoran Football Club in East Belfast. He has Protestant friends. He's president of a bicycling club, which is a kind of middle-class hobby. So he's a kind of relatively well-off Catholic who is politically absolutely a moderate. He's not a supporter of the IRA. He's a supporter actually of the old Home Rulers who are in decline at this stage. But he's not really a very political man. He's a businessman. Now, what happens when the front door is put in is that a group of armed men, some of them wearing police uniforms, we don't know exactly who they are. The IRA actually had some police spies, and because of that we've got a pretty good idea who some of them were. They seem to be a mixed crowd, some regular police, some regular RIC, some specials. They go into the house, they separate the men and the women, they bring the men downstairs to the front room and they open fire and they kill 6 of them. They shoot dead 6 members of the McMahon household, including a servant, I think. So there's 5 members of the McMahon family and then 1 servant. With extraordinary presence of mind, I think the younger son, who's about 12, rolls under the table and pretends to be dead. The newspaper accounts are horrific to read. Even 100 years later, they're horrific to read. They describe basically something that looked like a butcher's shop. I think it's the Newsletter or the Belfast Telegraph says it's like someone had taken a fresh liver from a bullock or something in a butcher shop and just thrown it around. It's a bloodbath. It's an absolute horrendous scene. Who did it? Who organised it? We don't know exactly, but it seems that the killers came from Brown Square Barracks. Brown Square Barracks is near the bottom of the Shankill. It doesn't exist anymore, but in those days, it's all part of that whole area that's been kind of redeveloped. It's not absolutely clear that they were led in person by a policeman called John Nixon, but he is the figure whose name keeps coming up in terms of organising death squads in this period. He's a hardline RIC district inspector, so senior police officer. He's from Cavan, which is interesting. So he is a Protestant, a unionist, but whose home is on the wrong side of the new Irish partition line. So that seems to create some sort of resentment and, say, extremist mindset. And he is the figure who seems to be really behind organising these death squads, although with the McMahon case he may not have been there present in person, we're not sure. There's another massacre about a week later, the Arnon Street massacre, where one figure gets his brains knocked out, one young Catholic man gets his brains knocked out with the same sledgehammer, and Nixon does seem to lead that one in person. The point is, elements of the police are out of control. And they're not trying to hide that they're police. They're turning up in police lorries. They're trying to send a message to the Catholic minority: keep your heads down, stop supporting the IRA, and we'll leave you alone. That's the basic messaging. It, of course, creates a huge amount of press interest. It's reported internationally, the McMahon murders, and it does give a push, actually, for Winston Churchill, who's the Home Secretary, to try and get James Craig, the leader of Ulster Unionism, Michael Collins, the leader of the IRA in the South, to get them together to try and do a peace deal, which doesn't last, but it does create a sort of pressure for some attempt at a peace deal. No one is ever punished for it, and Nixon goes on to have an extraordinary career. He, about 1923 or 24, he makes a speech that is so extreme in support of loyalism that the James Craig and the Ulster Unionist government feel that they finally have to sack him. So by this time, violence has died down in the autumn of 1922. Things are a bit calmer, and James Craig finally feels able to sort of take a harder line against his own extremists, which he hasn't felt able to do before when the violence was ongoing. So Nixon is sacked for making political speeches as a policeman. He then manages to reinvent himself as an independent, fairly hardline Ulster Unionist politician who sits in Stormont all through the 30s and the 40s. So he's a kind of fixture of the political scene. So he sits in the Northern Irish Parliament, not in the London Parliament, but in the Northern Irish Parliament. He doesn't really achieve very much there as an independent unionist, but I think his main achievement is in 1933 when he manages to make sure that the film King Kong is banned from Belfast because he considers it too dangerous to morals, having women not wearing very much picked up by a big gorilla is too scary. So that's really what happens to him. But it's striking that I think he wins a libel trial. Some people try and allege he's been involved in death squads. The evidence seems to be pretty clear that he had something to do with them, but he essentially gets away with it. Alt-Neve is no less complicated, takes place a couple of months later. In fact, we've just had the anniversary literally the other day, exactly 100 years ago. And that takes place down on the border between Armagh and Louth. So this new Irish border that has emerged. And I think, the thing to say about the Irish border is it's a crazy border. It was never meant to be a border. It's literally county lines that became an international frontier. And of course, in 1922, it doesn't have much meaning for people. A lot of life carries on as before. But as the Northern Irish government and the B Specials try to get a grip on the situation and try to suppress the IRA insurgency, they start putting more resources into policing the border and making it a real border for the first time. So South Armagh becomes a hotspot. Now, South Armagh is a hotspot later on in the Troubles as well. So it's an old pattern. It's, of course, a majority nationalist, Republican, Catholic area, but there are some Protestant communities. And a sort of rather vicious spiral of tit-for-tat violence between Specials and the IRA takes place. And it's difficult to know exactly what the causes were, what was in people's minds. There is a very nasty attack by A Specials on a pub in Drummondtee just beforehand. They commit sexual violence and sexual assault on a Republican family, a Republican woman. There's all the reporting of what's going on in Belfast, and particularly B Specials shooting Catholics in Belfast is very much in the headlines. There are attempts at IRA ambushes, and it seems that the trigger for Alt-Neve was a shooting by the Specials of two Catholic men who probably were not anything very important in the IRA, but are shot as suspected Republicans, and their bodies are left in the roadway on two mine craters. So two holes have been dug to plant bombs, and their bodies are left as a warning by the Specials, really as a warning to the Catholic community. Shortly after that, it all kicks off in Alt-Neve. Alt-Neve is a very small settlement. It's Presbyterian. All of the people living there are, say, Presbyterians, they're Protestants, they're Unionists. And a major IRA operation conducted by Frank Aiken, operating out of the other side of the border, coming from County Louth, basically picks out this settlement for really a warning. A sort of, if you like, it's possible to think about some of these local conflicts as as a bit like an auction. Each side sends a message to the other side to intimidate them, and it keeps escalating, if you like. But what happens at Altnevay is very unexpected. Irish Republicans believe in ending British rule. Their ideology is not anti-Protestant in theory. They've of course been Protestant Republicans. And so targeting Protestant civilians just because they're Protestants goes against core beliefs and core ideology. But sometimes it happens, and Altnevay is one case where it does happen. So the IRA basically create a swathe of about a mile of devastation of burnt out houses in which they shoot 6 Protestant men in the middle of the night. And what is clear is, although many of the IRA killers come from, say, over the border, they're not necessarily local, but locals are involved. How do we know that they're involved? Well, one, they know exactly which houses to pick out, but also in one house, the Heslett household, one of the women of the household, just before her husband is shot, says to one of the killers, "Joe, we didn't expect this of you." She has recognised him by his boots. Boots in 1922 are expensive footwear. Not everyone has them. He's got a good pair of quality boots on, and she recognises him despite his mask. They know who these people are who have come to target them. And, of course, like all of these horrors, it creates a long, long shadow. And it is, of course, remembered in the Protestant and Unionist community to today. And there were marches just literally 2 days ago or whatever to commemorate it. It's overshadowed by the fact that within a number of days, the political scene changes massively. The IRA splits. It splits for complicated reasons, but basically the peace deal that's been agreed with Britain in 1921 doesn't please everyone, partly because of partition, but also because at that stage the peace deal still expected Ireland to remain part of the British Empire and sort of loyal to the British monarch, and many Irish Republicans just found that utterly unacceptable. So the IRA splits, and on the 28th of June, say literally a few days afterwards, civil war breaks out in the south. Frank Aiken actually finds himself in a very awkward position. He tries to stay neutral. He tries to keep his unit out of the civil war. He can't in the end. He ends up on the anti-treaty side. But the irony of Irish politics in the Free State and what later in 1948 becomes the Republic is that the losing side in the Civil War, the anti-treaty side, the side that Frank Aiken ends up on, in many ways is seen in the long run by many people as the good side, the side that opposed an unsatisfactory peace settlement, an unsatisfactory peace deal. And so Frank Aiken has a second career, a very distinguished second career in various Fianna Fáil, various Irish governments in the sort of 40s and 50s, and represents Ireland at the United Nations, and really goes on to greater things. I think it's pretty clear from the records that are beginning to finally emerge now. They've been kept secret, they've been inaccessible for years, but lots of IRA pension records we can now go and read, in which people in the 30s and 40s recorded what they did back for the IRA in 1921 and 22. And it's pretty clear from them that there was a considerable embarrassment and a considerable pressure on the IRA side not to talk about Altnevay. Altnevay was not an operation they were proud of, but it happened. It wasn't forgotten, of course, on the other side. And as your wise question or questions points out, there is a certain symmetry. There's a certain symmetry between John Nixon in the Unionist political scene in Northern Ireland and Frank Aiken in the Free State south of the border, who are involved in horrific atrocities and still go on to have a public life in politics that is pretty successful afterwards.
We talked about Ireland being a template for modern terrorism. So what about Ireland being a template for conflict resolution?
Well, it's an excellent question. I think one needs to take long-term views. So, and perspective changes. Things look different at different times. In 1921, 1922, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, was seen as the Welsh wizard, the man who could do what no one else could do, the man who could solve the Irish question that had, from a British point of view, caused so much trouble to British politics from 1886 onwards. And he was seen as the man who had fixed it. And you see lots of cartoons of Lloyd George like a conjurer, like a magician who can sort of pull off the impossible trick of somehow dividing Ireland, but settling it at the same time. Of course, we know, as I say, that settlement was not stable. And the fact that London ignored the problems in Northern Ireland and was happy to ignore the problems in Northern Ireland for so long afterwards meant, of course, tragically, that the brief 20s troubles, Belfast is very bad from 1920 to 1922, but it's very short. But those are only the first troubles. You then get the second troubles from 1969 onwards, and they're very different. They're much longer lasting. They grind on and on and on until you get the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And usually when we speak about Ireland, Northern Ireland, as a model for conflict resolution, we're thinking about 1998. We're not thinking of these earlier attempts, but it's important to remember them because, things can look like a success and then 20, 30, 40 years later look like less of a success. And, the Good Friday Agreement comes at the end of 30 years of a very, very complex conflict with many actors in which, again, the IRA mounted an insurgency, a rebellion against the British state, just like in the 1920s. Again, the British state fought back. The British Army was much more involved than in the 1920s. But also a paramilitary war in which loyalists and Republicans organised themselves and committed all kinds of killings. So it's a very, very complex and shifting, really series of conflicts, I would say. The Good Friday Agreement is a remarkable achievement. It's a point I make to my students that I was born in 1971 and I was 27 years old before there was a peace deal in Northern Ireland. For me, growing up in England in the 70s and 80s, the Northern Irish troubles felt unending. They felt like they could never be ended. They felt like they were absolutely intractable and incapable of any kind of resolution. Now, that wasn't the case, and the deal that was done in 1998 did not please everyone, but it was still a remarkable achievement. Northern Ireland stayed part of the United Kingdom as long as the majority wanted, but there would be power sharing. There would not be a return to the sort of 1922 situation of just unionist dominance. And that is definitely a deal that saved lives, definitely a deal that drove levels of political violence and bloodshed down. It didn't totally solve the problem. There will always be some Irish Republicans who still think they're very much in the wrong state and still think it's worth trying to fight to overthrow British rule. But I think in terms of peace building, it was a remarkable achievement. However, the deal that you need to end a conflict and the deal that you need to create a stable democracy may be two different things. And the sort of deal that we had with the Good Friday Agreement, political scientists call it a consociationist deal, which is just a technical term for two enemies have to share power, basically two opposing sides have to share power. The problem with those deals is they're fragile and they sort of freeze politics in a kind of mould of unionists versus nationalists. And there has been, with the Alliance Party getting stronger in recent years, there has been increasingly those who say we need a new kind of politics. We need to kind of develop much more of a centre ground that is much less interested in the constitutional question, much less interested in the question of whether this place should be part of Britain or part of Ireland, and much more interested in a kind of more quote unquote normal, stable type of politics around delivering better public services, hospitals, etc., etc. The question is, whether you can ever get that when your whole political system is based around power sharing between camps that have already been defined. So the Good Friday Agreement has had a lot of criticism from people who study peace settlements. My own personal view is that it was the best deal that could be got at the time, but how we plan for the longer term, how we allow society to evolve and hopefully tensions to fade and different political alliances to emerge is a real challenge, and it's one that undoubtedly Brexit and the emphasis on Irish borders, the land border, the sea border, has definitely not helped. So yes, Ireland can be taken as a model for definitely conflict reduction and definitely peace settlements that help, but it would be naive to think that such a long conflict that has re-emerged several times over 150 years at least is going to be ended totally just by one peace settlement.
Thank you so much. It was brilliant. Thank you.